quiet moment between battles, the village of Konoha rested under a calm sky. But this peace was fragile, almost like glass waiting for a single touch to shatter it. The invasion of pain was no ordinary storm. It was a force born of conviction, shaped by suffering, and carried forward by a man who believed he had found the ultimate answer to the endless cycle of shinobi wars. In this story, we imagine a different path, one where the defenders of the leaf fell short, and the god-like figure known as Pain achieved the victory he had long sought. It is a tale of sorrow, of silence, and of what happens when the balance of the world tilts in a darker direction. As we step into this vision, let the story unfold slowly, each thought and moment drawn out like a lullaby, guiding you deeper into rest. Pain's assault began as it always had, 6 bodies moving as one mind, descending upon the village that had once been home to his dearest friend and bitterest loss. Konoha's shinobi fought with all their strength, with every ounce of courage they had carried into countless missions before. Yet in this imagining, the cracks in their defense widened faster, their responses faltered, and the resilience of the village was not enough to withstand the overwhelming presence of the 6 paths of pain. The roar of destruction filled the air, buildings collapsed, and even the mightiest shinobi found themselves cornered in the shadows of devastation. For all the valor of Konoha's heroes, the tide of the battle did not turn in their favor this time. The god of pain pressed forward, step by step, inevitable as the setting sun. Naruto, who had rushed back from his training at Mount Myoboku, still arrived too late to turn the tide. In the original tale, he brought with him the strength of sage mode, the wisdom of his masters, and the will to protect the bonds he held dear. But here, we imagine that his strength faltered just enough, his timing misaligned by fate's cruel hand. He struck at pain with the power of nature itself, but the 6 paths pressed against him relentlessly. Each clash of chakra sent tremors through the earth, each exchange chipped away at his resolve. He fought, and he fought again, but the god before him was not swayed. Pain's vision of justice, his demand for understanding through shared suffering, echoed louder than Naruto's pleas for peace. And so, the fight that should have been the dawn of Konoha's renewal instead became its twilight. The Shinra Tensei that followed was absolute. The almighty push spread across the village, not as a single strike, but as a wave that seemed to cleanse the land of all resistance. Houses, monuments, and histories crumbled in the span of a breath. The Hokage monument, carved with the faces of those who had once led with wisdom and love, cracked and fell into ruin. The trees that had surrounded the village, long symbols of its life and resilience, were torn away, leaving behind a barren scar on the land. The cries of shinobi and civilians alike echoed for a moment, then fell silent, swallowed by dust and the heavy air of defeat. Konoha, the proud leaf village that had stood for generations, was erased in an instant, as if it had never been. What remained was a void, a hollow space where dreams and legacies had once intertwined. As the dust settled, pain stood at the center of emptiness, the eyes of the sage of 6 paths glowing cold and unblinking. For him, this was not cruelty. It was justice. It was balance. His words carried across the ruins like a prayer, slow and measured, as if he spoke to the souls of the fallen rather than the living, who still clung to survival. He declared that the world would learn peace through the shared understanding of loss. The great villages would tremble, the nations would pause, and the dream of shinobi supremacy would give way to the sobering truth that even the mightiest could fall. Konoha, the village that had nurtured heroes and legends, was now the proof of his doctrine. It was no longer a place. It was a lesson, carved into memory by destruction for those who had survived the assault. Despair became their companion. Kakashi, who had given his all in the battle, could no longer rise. His body lay still among the ruins. The lone eye that had carried so many burdens finally closed. Tsunade, the 5th Hokage, had poured her life energy into shielding the villagers. But here, her efforts could not hold back the tide, and she collapsed amidst the wreckage, her will to protect unfulfilled. Shikamaru, Ino, Choji, and so many others who had carried the torch of the new generation were scattered, their bonds severed in an instant. And Naruto, the child of prophecy, the one who was meant to break the cycle, was left broken in the dust, unable to rise again. The prophecy had not failed. It had merely taken a different form, one written in silence and ash rather than hope and renewal. And so, the world beyond Konoha watched in shock as word of the village's fall spread. Other nations, who had once feared or envied the leaf, now stared at the void left behind. Some trembled at the thought of pain's power, while others whispered of opportunity, of lands to claim, and borders to redraw. But beneath all those shifting ambitions lay a deeper unease. If Konoha could fall, then no village was safe. Pain's victory was not just over one nation, but over the illusion of permanence that the shinobi world had clung to for so long. In one day, everything had changed. The story of what comes next unfolds slowly, like ripples across a still pond. With Konoha gone, the lives of countless shinobi take new directions, some into despair, some into anger, and some into resolve. But in this first chapter, all that remains is the silence of a village erased forever, and the figure of Pain standing over the void, his dream realized, his path carved into history. The silence after the destruction lingered like a shadow that would not fade, heavy and suffocating. In the ruins where streets had once bustled with laughter and the marketplace had thrived with simple joys, there was now only emptiness, broken timbers, and the faint scent of fire carried by the wind. For the survivors, wandering through this graveyard of memories was like walking through a dream that had soured into a nightmare. Children searched for their parents and found only silence. Comrades called for each other, but heard no answer. The heart of the shinobi world, which had once stood so proudly at the center of the 5 great nations, had been hollowed out in a single act. The symbol of resilience, of heritage, of bonds, Konoha was now nothing more than an open wound upon the land. Pain did not linger on sentiment. His Rinnegan eyes scanned the broken horizon as though he were reading scripture written in the ashes. To him, this was proof of his justice. He had carried Nagato's pain for so long, and now the world would carry it too. Standing tall, his voice carried not just to those few who survived, but to the imagined ears of all nations. Through suffering, peace will be born, he said, each word falling with the weight of inevitability. He did not smile, nor did he revel in destruction. His face was calm, distant, as though what had just transpired was no more than a necessary ritual in pursuit of a greater truth. And so, with Konoha gone, his message had been carved into the history of the shinobi world in a way no one could ignore. For the shinobi who still drew breath, the weight of their loss pressed down on them until it became difficult to even stand. Shikamaru's brilliant mind, once so quick to devise strategies even under pressure, now felt blank, clouded by the enormity of what had been taken. Ino's cries pierced the silence as she searched among the ruins, and Choji's hands trembled as he lifted debris in vain hope of finding those he loved. Hinata, who had always drawn courage from the dream of one day standing by Naruto's side, now felt her resolve waver as she gazed at him unconscious and broken, his body refusing to rise again. The fire that had burned in the hearts of the Leaf's shinobi was dimming, smothered by the vastness of their defeat. Far beyond the ruins, the news spread like a storm. Messengers and whispers carried the truth across borders, and when it reached the ears of the other Kaj, disbelief gave way to fear. In the land of lightning, the Raikage's fist trembled with rage as he slammed it against the table, his voice demanding answers, demanding retribution. But even he felt the chill of uncertainty. In the land of earth, Onoki, the aged Tsuchikage, closed his eyes with a weary sigh, muttering that the age of villages might be coming to its end. The Mizukage listened in silence, her thoughts hidden, though in her heart she knew that alliances and rivalries alike would have to be reconsidered. The world had been thrown into imbalance. If the strongest village could be wiped away in an instant, then the very order that bound the nations together had been undone. But it was not only the great leaders who felt the ripple of change. Across the shinobi world, families who had once prayed for peace now whispered in fear of what would come. Mercenaries and rogue ninja saw opportunities rising from the ashes, while common villagers wondered if their homes, too, would someday vanish beneath the weight of this new god's justice. The fall of Konoha had not just broken the leaf. It had cracked the illusion of security that all shinobi villages had built their strength upon. And so, a shadow of dread settled over the lands, deepening with each passing day. Nagato himself, hidden far away, felt the strain of his actions as his emaciated body shook from the toll of channeling such immense chakra. His life had been a series of sacrifices, of giving everything in the name of his dream. Yet as he stared into the rippling image of Konoha's ruins, he did not waver. He had long ago abandoned the comforts of doubt. He believed that through the shared weight of tragedy, through loss and through scars, the world would finally understand peace. In his heart, he told himself that the screams of the fallen would not be in vain. They were the seeds of a new world. But not everyone would accept his vision. Among the survivors, hatred began to bloom like weeds in a neglected field. Those who had seen their loved ones buried beneath rubble did not hear pain's call for understanding. They heard only his cruelty. In the silence of the night, when the winds whispered through the empty spaces where homes once stood, vows of vengeance were made. A generation of shinobi, orphaned and broken, would carry this hatred forward, even as they struggled to survive in the shadow of their loss. And so, though pain had ended Konoha, he had also sown the beginnings of new storms yet to come. Naruto, lying broken, but breathing faintly, became a symbol, even in defeat. Though he had fallen short, those who looked upon him still remembered the boy who had carried the will of fire in his heart. Some whispered that he had been the last light of the leaf, while others mourned that even he, the child of prophecy, could not turn the tide. His dreams of becoming Hokage, of uniting the village, of proving his worth to the world, all of them seemed to fade like smoke in the distance. Yet within his chest, his heart still beat, stubborn and steady, as though refusing to surrender fully. In that heartbeat lay the faintest possibility, fragile as it was, that something might yet rise from the ashes. And so, as night fell over the ruins, the survivors gathered in silence. They had no leader, no village, no home to return to. Only memories and grief bound them together. By firelight, they sat among the debris, their shadows long and wavering. The children cried softly into the arms of the few remaining elders. Shinobi stared into the flames, haunted by the faces of those they had lost. The once lively village was gone, and in its place was only the question of what came next. The world held its breath, and the story of the leaf turned a darker page. The night after Konoha's fall stretched long and unkind. The moon hung pale over the wasteland, its light casting ghostly outlines across the rubble. For those who still lived, sleep did not come easily. Every creak of shifting wood, every sigh of wind carried with it the memory of explosions and collapsing stone. The survivors huddled together, clinging to each other, not only for warmth, but for the fragile sense that they were not entirely alone. They whispered the names of the fallen, as though saying them aloud could somehow hold their spirits close. Yet silence answered back, and the silence was deeper than any words of comfort could reach. Naruto remained unconscious, his chest rising and falling faintly. Though his friends had dragged him to safety, they looked at him with both hope and despair. He had been their brightest flame, the one who seemed destined to turn hopeless battles into victories. And yet, now he lay broken, his body unable to rise, his dream of protecting the village dissolved with the village itself. Hinata kept close to him, her hand resting lightly near his own, her eyes wide and unblinking, as though afraid he would vanish if she looked away. She remembered her courage, the moment she had thrown herself between him and pain. But now, courage felt like an empty word, replaced by the ache of helplessness. She whispered his name softly, again and again, as though her voice might reach the part of him that still clung to life. Elsewhere, the ruins served as both grave and battlefield. Shinobi dug with bare hands, searching for signs of those who might yet be alive. They unearthed fragments of familiar streets, pieces of doors, scattered belongings. Each discovery carried the weight of loss. A sandal too small for the foot of anyone living. A scroll half burned, its jutsu forever lost. A photograph, cracked and dust-covered, its smiling faces staring up at them from a world that no longer existed. These relics were reminders that Konoha had not only been a fortress of shinobi, but a home filled with countless small lives and fleeting joys. Now, it was only fragments of memory, scattered and fading. Pain and his 6 paths had vanished into the night, leaving behind not victory songs or banners, but emptiness. The god of pain did not need to linger. His work was done. His message was clear. The leaf was gone, and with it the illusion of safety for the rest of the world. As he retreated into shadow, his mind replayed the years of suffering that had shaped him, the endless funerals, the graves of friends who had dreamed of peace but died in war. Each step away from Konoha was heavy, but his conviction bore him forward. He told himself that the cries of the fallen would echo across nations, forcing the world to confront the reality he believed in, that only shared pain could unite them. The survivors, however, did not hear philosophy. They heard only loss. Among them, Shikamaru sat with his head lowered, the usual sharpness of his thoughts dulled by grief. His father, Shikaku, was gone, lost in the collapse of the command center. For Shikamaru, it was more than the loss of a parent. It was the loss of guidance, of wisdom, of the quiet strength that had always steadied him. In the stillness, he felt the burden settle onto his shoulders. He was young, too young to carry such weight. And yet, there was no one left to bear it for him. He closed his eyes, and in the dark, he whispered a vow, not of peace, not of understanding, but of vengeance. Pain had not erased Konoha entirely. He had planted a seed in its ashes, a seed that would grow into resolve, no matter how many years it would take. Beyond the wreckage, the land of fire itself reeled. Villages and towns that had once looked toward Konoha as their protector now trembled at their own vulnerability. With no leaf shinobi to guard them, they were open, exposed to bandits, rogue ninja, and rival nations. The great forests that surrounded the village seemed emptier, their silence broken only by the distant cries of displaced families fleeing the destruction. The spirit of the land, once tied so deeply to the life of the leaf, felt diminished, as though even nature itself mourned the village's absence. Meanwhile, far away, other powers moved quietly. In the shadows, figures who had long dreamed of the leaf's fall whispered their approval. Orochimaru, hidden in one of his many lairs, smiled faintly at the thought of his former home reduced to dust. Yet even he, with all his twisted ambitions, felt a pang of surprise at the completeness of its destruction. For all his cunning schemes, he had never imagined Konoha could be undone so swiftly. Madara's vessel, the masked man known as Tobi, observed as well, his Sharingan glinting with unreadable intent. To him, Pain's victory was not an end, but a step in the path toward his greater plan. With the leaf gone, the world's balance had shifted, and he would use that shift to draw closer to the dream of the infinite Tsukuyomi. To some, Konoha's fall was tragedy. To others, it was opportunity. Back in the ruins, the remaining shinobi gathered the survivors. Ino tended to the wounded with trembling hands, her father gone, but her training compelling her to act. Choji sat in silence, his broad shoulders slumped, his appetite vanished. Rock Lee, who had always believed in the strength of perseverance, found his faith wavering for the first time, his fists clenched tightly at his sides as tears streamed down his cheeks. Each survivor carried within them a different shard of pain, sharp and unrelenting. Yet together, those shards began to form something fragile, an unspoken bond that held them upright in the face of despair. As dawn broke, pale light spilled across the ruins, revealing the true scope of the devastation. From the Hokage monument, now fractured and broken, to the academy grounds where children had once trained, all was silence. The will of fire, once spoken with pride, felt extinguished. But in the hearts of those who remained, something faint still flickered. It was not the bright flame of old. It was a spark, hidden, waiting for breath. In that spark lay the possibility that the leaf might not truly be gone, even if its stones and streets had been erased. The world had changed, and with it, the course of history. The morning that followed the fall of Konoha was unlike any morning the survivors had ever known. The sun rose timidly over the horizon, its golden rays breaking through clouds of dust that still lingered over the ruins. Yet the light seemed pale, powerless against the enormity of what had happened. Where streets once bustled with merchants and shinobi children running to the academy, there was only silence. Where banners of the Hokage once waved proudly, there was only smoke. The village that had stood as the heart of the shinobi world was now a graveyard. The survivors moved like shadows among the wreckage. They searched for the living and gathered the fallen, their steps slow and heavy. Faces were pale, eyes blank. It was not only exhaustion from the night's battle. It was grief, an ache so deep that words could not reach it. Shikamaru stood at the edge of the ruins, staring into the distance with a vacant gaze. His father, Shikaku, had been among those crushed beneath the collapse of the command post. The loss carved a hollow place inside him, and though he was young, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down harder than ever before. His mind, usually sharp and filled with strategies, could find no path forward now. Every road seemed blocked by grief. Ino, her hands trembling, tended to the wounded. Her father was gone too, yet she forced herself to keep moving, to keep healing. Tears threatened to cloud her vision, but she refused to stop. She whispered words of comfort, even as her own heart was breaking. Beside her, Choji silently lifted heavy beams, hoping against hope to find survivors. His normally cheerful face was tight with sorrow, his strength driven not by food or laughter, but by the desperate need to save what little remained. Rock Lee, his eyes red from sleeplessness, struck the ground with his fists until his knuckles bled, muttering again and again that he had not been strong enough. For a boy who had believed all his life in perseverance, this defeat felt unbearable. And at the center of it all lay Naruto. His body was battered, his chakra drained to its limits. Unconscious, he breathed softly, his chest rising and falling, as though caught between the worlds of the living and the dead. Hinata knelt beside him, never leaving his side. She remembered the moment she had thrown herself in front of him, her declaration of love, her desperate attempt to protect him. That courage had been met with pain's merciless strike, and yet here she was, alive, while the village she wanted to protect was gone. She held Naruto's hand gently, whispering his name, hoping that somehow her voice could reach him through the darkness. To her, his survival was the single thread keeping her from breaking entirely. Beyond the ruins, the land of fire trembled. Farmers and merchants who had once looked to the leaf for protection now whispered in fear. Without Konoha, who would defend them from bandits, from rogue shinobi, from rival nations waiting for weakness. Word spread quickly across borders, and with each retelling, the scale of the tragedy grew. To the common people, It was not only the fall of a village, but the shattering of an era. Konoha had been a symbol, and its destruction left behind a void that no one knew how to fill. In the shadows of distant lands, the news stirred both fear and ambition. The Raikage's fury shook the walls of his chambers as he demanded answers, his anger masking the unease in his heart. If even Konoha could fall, then nowhere was safe. The Mizukage listened in silence, her mind already turning to diplomacy and alliances. Onoki, the aged Tsuchikage, sighed heavily, muttering that the age of villages was crumbling before his eyes. And somewhere in the darkness, Orochimaru smiled faintly. The home that had rejected him, that had stood against his twisted ambitions, was now gone. Yet even he marveled at how quickly it had fallen. For Tobi, watching from the shadows, Pain's victory was not an end, but a stepping stone. With the leaf erased, his own plans for the infinite, Tsukuyomi edged closer to reality. He knew Pain believed himself the god of this new age, but Tobi had always thought of Pain as a tool, a necessary piece in his larger design. The destruction of Konoha created ripples across the shinobi world, ripples he could use to bend nations toward his own vision of a false peace. Yet to Nagato himself, this was not triumph. His frail body trembled as he sat hidden far away, his chakra drained, his strength waning. But his conviction held firm. He had borne his own pain for years, his parents lost in war, his friends taken from him, his home shattered. Now, the world would know that same pain, and from that shared suffering, he believed, would come peace. His heart was heavy, but his will was steady. Konoha had been the strongest of the great villages. By erasing it, he had proven that none were beyond reach. He had carved his truth into history, and he believed the world would not be able to look away. But for those left behind in the ruins, his words meant nothing. They did not feel the clarity of his vision. They felt only loss. Each survivor carried a shard of grief sharp enough to wound them with every breath. Yet even in their despair, the first sparks of defiance began to flicker. Choji, his fists clenched. Lee, whispering vows of strength. Shikamaru, lost in thought, but already nurturing a vow that one day, somehow, Pain would be held accountable. Pain had destroyed Konoha, but he had not erased the fire in their hearts. As dawn stretched higher, light fell upon the Hokage monument. The carved faces were cracked and broken, yet still they stood, watching silently over the ruins. To the survivors, the sight brought both grief and a strange kind of comfort. Their home was gone, but the will of those who had come before lingered. The will of fire was wounded, but not extinguished. It flickered faintly, hidden among the ashes, waiting for breath to bring it to life again. The village had fallen. The balance of the world had shifted. And in that fragile dawn, History itself had begun to turn. The days stretched into weeks, and what remained of the shinobi world began to take on a new rhythm, one shaped entirely by the long shadow of pain's victory. The ruins of Konoha, once a vibrant village, were now a silent warning to all who dared resist. Yet in that silence, survivors scattered to the winds, carrying fragments of memory and small embers of hope. It was not the kind of hope that blazed openly, but the quiet kind that smolders within, hidden from sight, waiting for the right breath to stir it into life again. Konan remained ever at Pain's side, her presence as calm and inevitable as falling rain. Where Nagato's will was unyielding, hers was steady, offering a softer balance to his harsh judgments. She spoke little, but her gaze carried volumes. To her, the dream of peace that Nagato pursued was not cruel in intention, but the path he had chosen was lined with suffering, and she bore the weight of that knowledge quietly. She stayed because she believed in him, because she knew the fragile boy who once cried beneath the ruins of a Megakure, and because even in his god-like role, he was still human beneath it all. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread beyond the borders of Fire Country. Whispers traveled quickly of a god who walked the earth, of the Leaf Village wiped away in an instant, of the shinobi alliance that never had a chance to form. Some feared him, others worshipped him, and a few thought of rebellion. But fear was the greatest force of all, and it kept even the boldest villages from moving against him directly. Instead, they watched from a distance, waiting for cracks to appear in this so-called divine rule. Among the survivors, a small group of Konoha shinobi gathered quietly in hidden forests and caves. They had no grand strategies, no weapons powerful enough to challenge Pain, only a determination to remember who they were. Shikamaru, who had once thought of himself as lazy and unmotivated, now found himself burdened with the task of leadership. His sharp mind, always reluctant to act, now had no choice but to calculate survival. He spoke rarely, but when he did, the others listened, because every word carried the weight of their future. Hinata, though wounded from the battle, endured with quiet strength. The memory of standing against Pain still echoed in her heart, not as a failure, but as a reminder that courage is measured not by victory, but by the will to stand, when standing seems impossible. She held on to that thought and whispered it to others when despair grew too heavy. Elsewhere, Kakashi drifted between the living and the dead. Having fallen in the defense of his village, his spirit lingered at the threshold, watching as the remnants of his students struggled in a world reshaped by loss. In this timeline, he was not revived, and his absence left a wound larger than any physical scar. Yet, even in memory, his teachings endured, guiding Naruto, guiding the others, like a voice that never faded. Naruto himself was not gone, though his spirit felt fractured. he wandered the lands, aimless at first, carrying with him the unbearable knowledge that he had failed to protect the village, that the nine tails within him was not enough to prevent its destruction. His usual fire dimmed, yet deep inside, something still pulsed. An instinct not to surrender. The world pressed heavily upon him, but Naruto had always been someone who found strength in bonds. Though so many of those bonds had been severed, the few that remained were enough to keep him moving forward, one weary step at a time. In the great void that followed Konoha's fall, Pain sat within the rain-soaked towers of a megacore, his mind constantly turning. Victory had been absolute, but peace was not yet secured. He looked upon the world and saw hesitation, saw fear, but not yet understanding. His plan required more. He believed that only through greater displays of overwhelming force could nations truly comprehend the futility of war. The cycle of hatred had to be broken with something final, something that no one could ignore. And so, he began to turn his gaze outward. Conan questioned him gently, as she always did, her words falling like paper blossoms carried by the wind. Was the destruction of one village not enough? Did the deaths of countless innocents not already weigh heavily upon the scales of fate? But Pain's resolve was like iron. To him, peace could not be born of mercy alone. It required a demonstration so absolute that no nation would dare to take up arms again. And so, the quiet after Konoha's destruction was only an interlude, a stillness before the storm that was yet to come. The world rested uneasily, like a forest waiting for fire, aware that the hand of a god still hovered above them, ready to strike again. Yet, within that same world, small threads of defiance continued to weave themselves together. Survivors of Konoha, shinobi from other villages who mourned the fate of comrades, even civilians who had lost homes to the wars of men, all of them began to feel the faint stirrings of unity. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was there. Because no matter how strong Pain's will was, no matter how absolute his power seemed, the human heart carried something he could not fully erase. The desire to endure, the dream to rebuild, the courage to whisper hope in the darkness. The story of what came next was not one of swift battles or sudden uprisings, but of a slow, steady current moving beneath the surface, a tide that even a god might not notice until it was too late. For in the silence after destruction, seeds are always planted. And though they may sleep beneath the soil, they are destined one day to rise again. The weeks and months after Konoha's fall were heavy with a quiet that almost felt alive. Survivors drifted through forests and hills, carrying the weight of memories and the faces of those lost. Every footstep through charred fields reminded them of the laughter that once echoed here, of children running to the academy, of the streets filled with life. The village had been erased, but its memory clung stubbornly to the living, whispering in the corners of their minds, in the moments when they dared to close their eyes, in the flicker of a dying candle at night. Naruto wandered along a riverbank, the water reflecting the pale sunlight, its surface unbroken by wind or ripple. He traced the reflection of his own face, tired and worn, and remembered the village he could not save. The burden of failure pressed down on him like the weight of the sky. Yet even in that weight, he felt a flicker, however small, of something that refused to die, a spark of determination, fragile but insistent. He could not forget. He could not surrender. The image of friends, lost, of the streets of Konoha burning beneath pain's power, fueled a quiet fire within him, a fire that whispered that the story was not yet over. Shikamaru moved silently alongside him, his shadow stretching long in the morning light. He had become the reluctant leader of the scattered survivors, tasked with holding together what little remained of the leaf's legacy. His mind was sharp, always calculating, always preparing for contingencies. Even in this devastation, he thought not only of survival, but of strategy, of finding the right moment to strike, of weaving the threads of resistance into something the world might not yet see. He spoke little, but his words carried weight, and those who followed him trusted that quiet wisdom, the wisdom of someone who understood that patience could be more powerful than fury. The landscape around them bore the scars of pain's power. Trees were uprooted, rivers diverted, buildings crushed into splinters, birds had vanished, and even the wind seemed subdued, as if the earth itself had been subdued by the presence of a god. Yet life persisted stubbornly in small ways, a flower growing between cracks in stone, the soft hum of insects returning to a silent field, the distant cries of animals fleeing through empty forests. These small signs of resilience reminded the survivors that the world had not entirely yielded, that even in the shadow of godlike destruction, life could endure. Pain himself remained distant, watching the nations and the people from afar. Each move he made was deliberate, measured, a reminder of the consequences of defiance. To him, the world must understand that peace demanded acknowledgement of suffering. Yet even as he plotted, he could not fully see the tiny, almost invisible shifts that were occurring elsewhere, the scattered hearts that refused to bow, the quiet vows made in hidden valleys, the slow gathering of those who would one day challenge his vision. Among the survivors, determination was born not only from grief, but from memory. Choji, who had once been defined by his appetite and humor, now moved with a silent focus, carrying those who were too weak to walk. Hinata's courage inspired others, her soft voice offering reassurance in a world that had been stripped of certainty. Each act, small and nearly invisible, became a defiance in itself, a refusal to let Konoha's story end entirely. As the seasons changed, the survivors learned to move like shadows, blending into forests, avoiding patrols, and finding refuge in caves and abandoned temples. They trained in secret, whispering their lessons to each other, not for immediate revenge, but for the slow, inevitable reckoning they knew must come. Even in this exile, bonds were reforged. Friendships were renewed in whispered conversations and shared meals cooked over hidden fires. The heart of the village, though buried beneath rubble, pulsed still in the people who remembered, who refused to let their heritage vanish. Konan remained a silent observer of pain's rule, her presence a constant reminder of the human cost behind his vision. She moved quietly through the shadows, aware of the consequences of each action, and yet faithful to the man she had loved and the ideal he pursued. She understood the burden of power, the fragility of life, and the delicate balance between justice and cruelty. Her heart carried sorrow, but also a kind of understanding, a knowledge that what had been lost was not easily measured, and that even in ruin, choices had meaning. Nagato, seated in the rain, felt the strain of his actions, but remained unwavering. The destruction of Konoha had been absolute, yet he knew the world still resisted him in ways he could not fully anticipate. In the quiet of his solitude, he pondered the cycle of hatred, the endless wars, and the possibility that even gods could not fully control human hearts. For all his power, there were currents he could not see, ripples in the world that moved silently beneath the surface, shaping events beyond his command. And so the world waited, unknowing of the forces gathering in secret. Pain's victory was complete in one sense, absolute and terrifying. Yet beyond the ruins, the survivors carried the unbroken strands of hope, the quiet determination to endure, and the hidden promise that the leaf story was not finished. Each day, each breath, each small act of defiance stitched together the beginnings of something that even the god of pain could not yet erase. In the silence of the forests, in the hidden valleys, and along rivers that reflected the pale light of a cautious sun, the first seeds of rebellion stirred. They were small, quiet, and almost invisible, but they existed. And in that existence lay the heartbeat of a future that pain had not fully claimed, the whisper of life that would one day rise from the ashes, gentle but relentless, like a breeze threading through ruins that refused to sleep. The story was nearing its turning point, though none could yet know how the pieces would fall. The leaf had been erased, the world trembled, and the god of pain watched, believing his vision complete. Yet even in his shadow, the slow, steady pulse of human resilience continued, quietly, insistently, waiting for the moment it could once again awaken fully. Time passed, measured in quiet days and restless nights. The survivors of Konoha moved through hidden valleys, forests, and abandoned temples, carrying with them the memories of everything they had lost. Every sunrise reminded them of what was gone, and every sunset pressed the weight of grief deeper into their bones. Yet, in that grief, they discovered a subtle, stubborn resilience. Though the village had been erased, the hearts of its people had not. Every whispered vow to survive, every quiet promise to protect one another, became a thread, weaving slowly into the beginnings of something larger, something unbroken. Naruto walked at the edge of a river, water reflecting his weary face, the sunlight catching the faint glimmer of determination in his eyes. His body had healed over time, but the burden he carried remained heavy. The memories of friends lost, of streets reduced to ash, of the cries of children he could not protect, were etched into him. Yet he moved forward, step by step, driven by an instinct that had never left him, the belief that even in the deepest darkness, light could be found. He remembered the warmth of the village he had loved, the laughter of those he had grown with, and the dream he had once carried so simply, to be a protector, to stand as a symbol of hope. That dream had not died. It was now tempered by sorrow, shaped by pain, but it remained alive. Shikamaru continued to guide the survivors with quiet determination, organizing their movements, coordinating supplies, and teaching strategies for survival. He understood that brute force could not challenge pain directly. The world had shifted, and patience had become their most potent weapon. Plans were whispered in the dark, executed silently in hidden corners. Each small act of preparation was a refusal to surrender, a quiet defiance against a God who believed himself absolute. Even the smallest victories, a saved life, a recovered food supply, a safe passage through dangerous territory, were celebrated in silence, as if acknowledging them aloud might summon new dangers. Pain, in distant lands, watched the nations tremble under the weight of his victory. He believed himself the arbiter of justice, a God who had taught the world the meaning of suffering. Each act of devastation he had committed was, in his mind, a step toward a future where hatred would cease and peace would reign. Yet, even as he surveyed the trembling lands, he could not sense the small, persistent currents of resistance, the hidden determination that refused to bow. Human hearts are not easily subdued. They twist, they hide, they grow stronger in ways even the God of pain cannot fully predict. Konan remained at his side, a silent witness to his choices, understanding the burden he carried, the vision he clung to. She knew that power was not enough to secure peace. It required understanding. It required humanity. It required listening to the whispers of those who survive and endure. She moved with him through the rain-soaked streets of distant towns, a quiet balance to his relentless drive, knowing that even gods must reckon with the consequences of their actions. Among the scattered survivors, the faintest sparks of unity began to take shape. Choji trained in secret, his body stronger now, his spirit tempered by grief. Rock Lee honed his skills tirelessly, each strike and movement a silent vow that he would be ready when the time came. Hinata inspired others not through words, but through presence, a gentle force that reminded them of courage even in the absence of certainty. Every survivor carried memories and scars, but together they began to form the beginnings of a new collective strength. The leaf was gone, but the people of the leaf were not. The world, too, began to shift in quiet ways. Villages that had watched Konoha fall with fear and awe now noticed patterns in the movements of survivors. They saw resilience, a quiet determination to endure, and they began to whisper possibilities. That the leaf might rise again. That even the most absolute force could not erase the human spirit entirely. The godlike power of pain was undeniable, yet it could not touch every hidden corner, every whispered vow, every secret act of defiance. Life, stubborn and persistent, continued quietly beneath the shadow of his authority. In the quiet moments of night, the survivors would sit together among hidden fires, sharing stories of the village that had been, of friends and family lost, of lessons learned. They spoke softly, in voices meant only for each other, knowing that even in grief there was a kind of teaching. They remembered, they mourned, and they planned, not for immediate revenge, not for sudden reckoning, but for the slow, inevitable return of the leaf, carried not by stone or mortar, but by the hearts of its people. Nagato, seated alone in the rain, could not feel these currents. He had seen power and devastation, but he could not sense the subtle growth of hope and resilience, the way a sapling grows unseen beneath fallen leaves. He had believed that suffering alone could create understanding, that the erasure of Konoha would force the world to acknowledge peace. Yet life has a way of persisting, of bending around the mightiest forces, of quietly preparing for moments when even gods may falter. And so, the story of Konoha did not end with the fall of the village. It continued quietly in the forests, in hidden valleys, along the banks of rivers that reflected the faint morning light. The leaf lived in memory, in whispered vows, in the careful training of the young, in the patient strategy of the survivors. Pain's vision was vast and unyielding, yet it could not touch the resilience that grew slowly, almost imperceptibly, beneath the surface of despair. The day would come when the spark of defiance became a flame, when the memories of what had been lost fueled action, when the hearts of the living rose together to reclaim their story. And until that day, the survivors moved quietly, step by step, breath by breath, carrying with them the enduring spirit of the village that no god could entirely erase. In the stillness of the ruined land, the wind whispered softly through the broken streets, through the shattered stones and the empty rooftops. It carried with it the faint promise that even after the deepest darkness, life could persist, hope could endure, and the heart of Konoha would beat again, slowly, patiently, eternally. The story of the leaf had changed forever, but it had not ended.